What's up, HDP AP? HDP AP Econ, how are we? This video continues our macroeconomic investigation into national income and price determination, aka macroeconomic equilibrium. Our three big macroeconomic variables of consideration: output, aka GDP. Remember, we're keeping it real. That's economic output adjusted for change in the price level. All right. Then we're talking about unemployment. Remember our three types of unemployment: frictional and structural always exist, full employment, natural rate of unemployment. You know all about that. And then we're talking about the price level, inflation. We use the GDP deflator in this model to identify and analyze inflation. So what's the purpose of the video? In the beginning, we're going to start with what in this particular module? All right, short run equilibrium using what? The aggregate demand curve and the short run aggregate supply curve, right? We'll reintroduce the long run aggregate supply curve momentarily, but we're going to identify equilibrium in the short run where AD, aggregate demand, intersects with aggregate supply, understanding that this will demonstrate the aggregate price level and real output. Why? What? Yeah, why? We also refer to GDP as Y. We use that initial to identify real output. Y technically means income, but remember, we can measure either all the money that's spent on final goods and services or the income generated from those same goods and services. So at equilibrium, we can identify the aggregate price level and what's going on with real output, right? Remember, aggregate output is on the horizontal axis. The price level is on the vertical axis. And when we identify those two variables, we can also infer what's going on with our other important macroeconomic variable, unemployment, right? Unemployment. Then we will introduce LRAS, long run aggregate supply curve, and we'll talk about potential output. In the long run, we have this situation where wage prices and resource prices are at a nice equilibrium with the price level. Everything's copacetic. The long run aggregate supply curve demonstrates what nation's potential output when we're at full employment. And then we'll talk about these ideas of gaps, recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps. And these gappies will be much easier to identify and discuss when we look at them graphically, but it's important to talk about in the short run we can be out of whack, right? Yes, there could be a situation where short run macroeconomic equilibrium coincides with the long run aggregate supply curve and everything's hunky-dory, happy-go-lucky, Goldilocks economy, but we're going to be really concerned with the times when it's out of whack and what's going on with the recessionary or inflationary gap. Economics is not just a bunch of lines on some graphs. It's about real things that happened in the world. GD, Great Depression, not good. 1929, 1933, the worst 4 years of the Great Depression. Right? You watch the John Maynard Keynes video about what happened. Right? Consumption fell by at least 1/5 or 20%, and gross business investment collapsed, causing a major leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve, leading to the Great Depression. GDP fell by 53.4%. Unemployment reached 25%. Right? We're going to demonstrate that on a graph, or that same idea from other recessions, and talk about how that affects output, price level, and employment. Then in the late 1970s, early 1980s, we had this negative supply shock. Right? At this point in U.S. economic history, oil represented 30% of all inputs. So when you add up the land, the capital, labor used to produce economic output for the country, oil was 30% of the economic inputs that generated output for the economic engine. And we had this price shock because Iran, Iraq, OPEC, right? They decided to collude and cut production. That caused a major leftward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve, leading to a situation called stagflation. So we're going to be able to use the aggregate demand aggregate supply model to demonstrate shifts in either aggregate demand and or aggregate supply and analyze these fluctuations. You guys ever play poker? Read them and weep. I actually don't play poker. I'm really not a good poker player, but this slide's pretty straightforward, right? Read it and learn it. Short run equilibrium price level is the aggregate price level in the short run macroeconomic equilibrium, right? We get that. Short run equilibrium output is the quantity of output produced in the short run macroeconomic equilibrium. This is just obvious, but it's important to review the obvious so that we can get the technically difficult later on. Now we're just going to reiterate the same point, but graphically, right? So on the right-hand side, we got our ADAS model. But remember, this is the short run aggregate supply curve with the aggregate demand curve. Quick review, aggregate demand is what? The total amount of real output that all buyers, C, I, G, and X, exports, want to purchase at the price level, demonstrated on the vertical axis. Short run aggregate supply curve, aggregate supply is what? The amount of real output that producers want to make available for sale at the price level. So in the short run, equilibrium occurs where what? Aggregate demand intersects or is equal to aggregate supply. As pictured on this graph, YE, right? Real output is at long run range perfecto, about 2.5% economic growth, which means we'd be at full employment of about 4.25% unemployment. We got a little frictional, a little structural, nothing else. And we have price level on the vertical, right, our GDP deflator, we got about 2% inflation. All right, so this is the perfect scenario. Time to shift our focus from the short run to the long run, right? What did John Maynard Keynes say? In the long run, we're all dead, but we need to know about the long run aggregate supply curve. So look at our graph. What have we added? Our vertical long run aggregate supply curve. What does that tell us? The amount of real output that producers want to make available for sale when we're at full employment domestic output. When we're using all of our available land, capital, and labor. Think of operating on the production possibilities curve. So GDP growing at about 2.5%. Unemployment is at the natural rate of unemployment or full employment. We got about 4% unemployment. And we got inflation under control perfectly at 2%, right? So what have we done? We simply added our long run vertical aggregate supply curve to our short run analysis, our upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve and our downward sloping aggregate demand curve. And we've modeled macroeconomic equilibrium in the long run. Now, take careful notice of this. In this situation, we have short run equilibrium, or SRAS, short run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand intersect at the same point that they're on the long run aggregate supply curve. So we call this what? Potential output, right? The economy is in long run macroeconomic equilibrium. So this is the goal. We want to operate here. This is the everything's perfect in the world when we have a situation where short run macroeconomic equilibrium is in line with long run potential. But as we said on previous slides, things can get out of whack, and that's where we're going next. What happens when we're not so perfect, when we have a leftward shift in aggregate demand or a rightward shift in aggregate demand, or a leftward or rightward shift in aggregate supply, and it messes everything up. Can't think of anything to do, yeah. My left brain knows it all. My love is fleeting. She's just looking for something new. Well, I said it once before, but it bears repeating. By the way, you guys like white stripes? I'm going to be repeating myself for something important again. This idea of gaps. What? Output gap, right? Output gap. So here's what can happen in the short run. All right, we could have a situation where the aggregate demand curve or the short run aggregate supply curve can shift. All right, leftward, rightward shift. Decrease in aggregate demand, decrease in aggregate supply. All right, short run aggregate supply, that is. All right, leftward shift, increase in aggregate demand, increase in short run aggregate supply. All right, there could be a shift. So that creates what's called a gap, an output gap. So there's two possibilities, right? The output gap is the difference between actual output and potential. The difference between actual output and potential, that's what an output gap is. So we could have a recessionary gap, right? And that happens when what? Output falls short of potential. Think about what's happening during a recession. GDP is weak, contracting, falling. We're not near our potential level of output when we got human beings sidelined who be liking to work and the economy is not operating on all cylinders. Or we could have an inflationary gap. Right? This happens when aggregate output rises above potential output. Right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to use the tools of aggregate demand and short and aggregate supply to demonstrate graphically the immediate effects of these shifts and identify recessionary and inflationary gaps. So remember, the long run aggregate supply curve demonstrates the amount of real output, real GDP that all producers, small, medium-sized, and large businesses, will make available for sale when we're at full employment. Long run aggregate supply curve vertical represents a nation operating on its production possibilities curve. We are achieving our potential level of output. So take a look at Y1, P1, E1. Macroeconomic equilibrium at E1, what's happening? Well, a short run equilibrium where AD1, aggregate demand curve 1, intersects with short run aggregate supply curve 1 is happening at where? At our long run potential. So at E1, everything is hunky-dory, happy-go-lucky, perfect in the world. Right? At Y1 level of output, the economy is growing at about 2.5%. We have about 4.4% unemployment. And price level at P1, we have inflation of about 2%. Now, something's going to happen that messes it all up. Something always messes things up, right? So look what happens. We have a shift, a leftward shift of what? Aggregate demand. So what is aggregate demand again? The amount of real output that all buyers, C, I, G, X, want to purchase at the given price level. Think back to our lessons on aggregate demand. What could cause the aggregate demand curve to shift leftward? Think consumer spending and investment spending, private sector spending. So if consumers lose confidence, we talk about consumers and their expectations, right? Consumers lose confidence and we'll say the stock market takes a dive by 35%. All of a sudden we have a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Simultaneously, businesses look at the horizon and they're not too happy about their profitability potential. Remember, profit drives business decisions. If their sales / revenue are down 20%, there's going to be no incentive to purchase additional machines and equipment. There'll be no incentive to refurbish any existing capital. There'll be no incentive to spend on new logistics systems. A leftward shift in aggregate demand now causes equilibrium to change from E1 to E2. So check out what's happening at E2. First, evaluate potential GDP Y1 to where we are now. Our new reality, our short-run macroeconomic equilibrium at E2, Y2 is well short of our potential level of output. That is to say, real GDP is short of potential GDP. And we look at that difference between Y2 and Y1, that's the recessionary gap. The difference between where we could be producing and where we are producing. Remember when we studied Ocon's law, and the idea that for every 1% of cyclical unemployment, there's a 2% GDP gap, negative GDP gap. So unemployment has risen when we had this experience, this leftward shift in aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. So unemployment's up, real GDP has fallen, and price level, there's no upward pressure on price level. Right, we would call this disinflation from P1 to P2. That, my friends, is the recessionary gap. What about the opposite problemo? Assume the economy is at equilibrium at E1. Macroeconomic equilibrium at E1 in the short run. Aggregate demand AD1 is intersecting with short run aggregate supply curve SRAS1 at E1. So the economy is achieving potential level of economic output. Real GDP is growing at about 2.5% at Y1. Unemployment's about 4%, and we have about 2% inflation at P1. Everything's perfect, and then what happens? Spending becomes excessive. We see this rightward shift in aggregate demand from 81 to 82. Too much money chasing too few goods. Right? Spending outpaces the economy's ability to produce. So what's going on? Look, we can eke out more outputs. We have some more spending, which means GDP expands from Y1 to Y2. But what's the cost? What's the cost? So unemployment's not a problem. Right? Unemployment is actually going to be below the full employment or natural rate of unemployment at Y2. So unemployment has fallen below 4%, but the excess spending drives up price level from P1 to P2. Therefore, we have what's called an inflationary gap. So when short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is beyond the nation's long-run potential, it creates an inflationary gap. Alrighty, time for students to demonstrate their understanding of concepts just explained, the recessionary gap and inflationary gap. So this is the type of question you would see on the free response AP exam. Refer to the graph below. So we look at this graph below, where it provides short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and also provides long-run aggregate supply, and it gives you an equilibrium at E, price level P1, and Y1 level of output, right? Real GDP level on the horizontal, right? Aggregate price level on the vertical. It says, okay, refer to that graph. P1, Y1 at that level of equilibrium. Is the economy in short-run macroeconomic equilibrium? Yes or no, and explain. You can't just say yes or no. And B, is the economy in long-run macroeconomic equilibrium? Explain. Then what type of gap exists in this economy? What type of gap? So take a moment, think about this one, pause the video, and then look at the answer. But don't look at the answer until you try to figure it out yourself. Two-part question. The first part, rather straightforward. Is the economy in short-run macroeconomic equilibrium? And the answer is yes. Why is it yes? Well, because short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is just where short-run aggregate supply, SRAS, the upward sloping red short-run aggregate supply curve, intersects with our downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So at point E, yes, the economy is in macroeconomic equilibrium where these two curves intersect. The tougher of the two questions, are we in long-run macroeconomic equilibrium? No, because why? Long-run macroeconomic equilibrium only occurs when we have a collision, collide, where we have long-run aggregate supply coincides with short-run aggregate supply. So that's not the case here, because we can see the vertical long-run aggregate supply curve lies to the left of current short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So we're not in long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Now the last part, what type of gap exists? I will look at where we are, E, relative to potential GDP. So E, 1200 level of real GDP, is beyond the potential 1000 level of real GDP. Therefore, if you said the economy is experiencing an inflationary gap, you are correct. I'm shocked. I'm shocked to find out. I was the last one to know. I never thought this would happen. I'm so shocked. What the heck are we talking about? All right, aggregate demand in the short run. Short run aggregate supply, we're going to talk about shocks. We're going to talk about leftward or rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve, either a decrease in aggregate demand or an increase in aggregate demand in the short run, or a leftward decrease in short run aggregate supply or rightward increase in short run aggregate supply, and their effect on aggregate output, aka GDP, unemployment, and inflation. We're also going to distinguish between demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. So again, when identifying and discussing either a leftward or rightward shift in aggregate demand in the short run, a decrease in aggregate demand or an increase in aggregate demand, known as a demand shock, or a left or rightward shift of the short run aggregate supply curve known as a supply shock. Most important is how do these shocks affect macroeconomic equilibrium and therefore output, employment, and price level. Assume we are at E1 to begin with, equilibrium macroeconomic style. So macroeconomic equilibrium in E1 with an aggregate output of Y1 and a price level of P1. Everything seems to be perfectly good in the economy, growing at about 2.5%. Unemployment right at our natural rate of unemployment, about 4%. Price level about 2%, 2% inflation, right? And all of a sudden we have this shock. Demand shock. We have a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. What is the leftward shift or negative demand shock? How does that affect output, price level, right, and unemployment? So one important idea to remember is that when we have a leftward shift in aggregate demand, output and price level move in the same direction. GDP falls, price level falls. That will be bad for unemployment to actually cause unemployment to increase. But when we have a leftward negative demand shock, output and price level move in the same direction, and that is down. Now let's investigate the opposite, a positive demand shock. Again, assume we start at E1, level of output Y1, P1. So the economy is near our full employment level of domestic output or potential GDP. Economy is growing at about 2.5%. We got about 4% unemployment, and we got about 2% inflation, and then shock, an increase in aggregate demand. Rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, a positive demand shock. Well, how is that going to affect output and price level? Right? Output will increase, move from Y1 to Y2, and this will have inflationary pressures in the economy, drives up the aggregate or average price level from P1 to P2. Quick reminder, right? Demand shocks, output and price level move in the same direction as the shift in aggregate demand. So if there's an increase in aggregate demand, as pictured here, more output, Y, right? Y increases, GDP increases in real terms, and increase in price level. Time to talk about the worst case scenario, the worst possible outcome for our macroeconomic equilibrium. Again, start at E1, you know the drill, right? Everything's okay in the economy at Y1, P1. And then we have a negative supply shock, right? A leftward shift in the aggregate supply curve, but this is the short run aggregate supply curve. Remember earlier in the video, we discussed that period of time in the late 70s, early 80s, where we had significant increase in the price of one of our key economic inputs, that is oil. So a negative supply shock, right? So what happens as a result of the short run aggregate supply curve shifting left? And this is bad on multiple levels. First, notice that output Y has decreased from Y1 to Y2, so this is recessionary with less economic output. And it also causes price level to increase. When this happened in the late 70s, economists had to come up with a new term because this was not a typical occurrence. Normally we have this trade-off between unemployment and inflation during boom-bust cycles, as discussed in class before. Right, during an economic boom, when aggregate demand gets a little bit excessive, we deal with inflation. During an economic bust, when aggregate demand shifts to the left, we deal with unemployment. But look what happens here when we have a simultaneous problem with both our price level and the level of output. The new term stagflation, right? Slower economic activity because Y contracts, GDP contracts, at the same time upward pressure on price level, right? So next step down the road when we start talking about fiscal and monetary policy, this situation handcuffed both the federal government from the standpoint of fiscal policy, and it was a conundrum for our monetary authorities, our central bank. We will discuss how later on the central bank, under the leadership of Paul Volcker, decided, hey, we got two dragons to slay here, inflation and slower growth with high unemployment, and he figured if we can get inflation back in check, it would be the best approach. But that's further down the road how we talk about the problems that's presented for policymakers, and the ultimate painful but solution. Well, looky there. If a negative supply shock, a leftward shift of the short run aggregate supply curve, is the worst case scenario for the economy, what's the best case scenario for the economy? The opposite. A rightward shift of the short run aggregate supply curve, aka a positive supply shock. So again, identify E1, P1, Y1. If we have more or better resources, an increase in the quantity or quality of resources, or an improvement in technology / productivity, the short run aggregate supply curve will boom, shift to the right. And what does that affect? How does that affect output and price level? Well, look, from E1 to E2, aggregate output Y1 to Y2 increases, so we have economic growth, more production, and price level comes down from P1 to P2. We call this non-inflationary economic growth. Now, final idea, as opposed to shifts in aggregate demand, aka shocks in aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply curve shifts, right? Aggregate output and the price level move in opposite direction. Right. Now you can memorize that, or you can just graph it and understand it. It's preferable to graph it and understand it, but good to think of it and say, okay, short run shocks, short run aggregate supply curve, increase in short run aggregate supply, output up, price level down, decrease in short run aggregate supply, output down, price level up. So nice of the textbook author to make a slide which summarizes ideas we've already covered and taught, but that's all right, right? Talk about ADAS, aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and the possible changes that can lead to an increase in the aggregate price level. So this is a review of what we call cost push inflation versus demand pull inflation. So remember, cost push inflation is caused by negative supply shock, short run aggregate supply curve shifting leftward, upward pressure on prices with reduced outputs, and I already discussed this in some detail. That's what happened during the 1970s / early 80s. Remembering that oil was 1/3 of our economic input, so you take all the land, capital, and labor used to produce the economic output of the United States, and oil was 30% of our resources used. So that increase in the price of oil, the oil crisis, had a terrible effect on the U.S. economy. All right, demand pull inflation, we're at equilibrium, Y1, PL1, everything's good, growth about 2.5%, unemployment about 4%, and have inflation about 2%. And then we have excess in aggregate demand. Rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, an increase in aggregate demand that puts upward pressure on prices. So the other cause of inflation, demand pull inflation. The example here is something I've really never discussed before, but interesting to learn new things. After World War II, what happened? Geez, we had all this income generated from the war economy, led to an increase in consumer spending after the war, and that had inflationary pressures. So much money to spend, the economy has a limited ability to produce, creating some demand pull inflation. So after covering in detail the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve model of the economy, understanding both short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply and macroeconomic equilibrium, why GDP in real terms, right, aggregate price level, unemployment, what type of question might the AP exam ask you to demonstrate understanding of this macroeconomic knowledge? Here's one. Use a correctly labeled aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph starting at long run equilibrium to illustrate cost push inflation. And then give an example of what might cause cost push inflation in the economy. Now, we just covered this, but very important rule about the AP economic exam and getting these FRQs, free response questions, correct. Do what they ask you. All right, so do what they ask you. Read the question twice, make sure you're understanding it, and then do what they ask you. So what are they asking you to do here? They said, starting at long run equilibrium, aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. So you need to include long run equilibrium. So how would you start this graph? Right, you draw your vertical long run aggregate supply curve. Then you construct your short run aggregate supply curve, upward sloping, and your aggregate demand curve so that it intersects with your long run aggregate supply curve. and you demonstrate what? Potential GDP at that equilibrium. And you go from there, right? So I'm going to leave you to your intellectual capabilities to answer the rest of the question. Let's see how we did. Pause the video for a moment, answer the question, and then see how you did on the next slide. So this question is worth theoretical 9 points on your AP exam. Let's see the breakdown on how this question would be graded. First, did you label your axes correctly? Right? So horizontal axis, not just GDP, real GDP. Don't assume that the AP graders think that you know it's real GDP. Write the word real GDP. Make certain, right? So real GDP is measured on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, you have your aggregate price level, right? Now you might get away with writing just price level, but don't write just price, because price refers to what? Not aggregate demand and aggregate supply, but a single market analysis of demand and supply. So might as well write the whole thing out aggregate price level, right? So first you label your axes correctly, and then you get your 1 point for aggregate demand curve downward sloping, and 1 point for the short run aggregate supply curve upward sloping. So if you look on the graph constructed on this slide, so far we have our axes labeled correctly, our blue downward sloping aggregate demand curve, our SRAS1 upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. And then of course we got to add in our long run aggregate supply curve, which is vertical, right? And label it LRAS. Don't just assume that that the graders know that you know it's the long run aggregate supply curve, right? It's also important that at the point underneath the long run aggregate supply curve at E1, right? So if you look on the horizontal axis, you label it Y, but you label it Y subset P, because you're informing the graders that you know this is aggregate output at potential GDP. So far you've graphed the short run aggregate supply curve, SRAS1, and the downward sloping aggregate demand curve, AD1, and the long run aggregate supply curve, and you've labeled everything correctly, right? You put the point where they all intersect at E1, and you've labeled that YP for potential economic output, right? Think operating our production possibility frontier. And you've also correctly labeled P1, right? Price level. Now you have to talk about, well, what happened that caused cost push inflation in the economy? So first you think, okay, cost push inflation, negative supply shock. So that's going to affect short run aggregate supply. So you draw a leftward shift in aggregate supply. So you see the leftward shift from SRAS1 to SRAS2, and you have your new equilibrium, right? This temporary situation at E2. So then you must say, okay, well, what happened at E2, right? The first thing that happened at E2 is inflation, higher price level from P1 to P2, right? What also happened at E2? In addition to upward pressure on price level, you had a decrease in aggregate output or real output, real GDP. You also have to say, okay, well, what would be the ultimate cause of this negative supply shock? And this is something we just discussed. You could talk about either energy prices or labor prices, any factor which increased the price of aggregate inputs would cause a negative supply shock. You could even mention the COVID supply chain issue that occurred shortly after the pandemic, where we had this glut, we had this cluster where we couldn't reach our efficiency in aggregate supply, and it caused aggregate supply to shift leftward, causing cost push inflation. Time waits for no man, and it is time to move on to the next module, my friends. All right, what's the purpose of this module? What are we going to learn next about macroeconomics? So exciting. All right, so in the John Maynard Keynes video about Keynesian economics and the Great Depression, you had this economic debate, this academic intellectual divide between classical theorists the disciples of Adam Smith and Jean-Baptiste Say. Jean-Baptiste Say was a famous French economist who came up with the economic adage, supply creates its own demand, and the new Keynesians. The classical theorists, the disciples of Adam Smith, had this idea about capitalism and business cycles that in the long run, because of the flexibility of wages and prices, that there would be this automatic adjustment to restore full employment domestic output. John Maynard Keynes did not disagree with the classical theorists. He actually is/was a capitalist himself, but his famous saying, yeah, in the long run, there will be restore full employment and domestic output. But the long run can be a mighty long time. In the long run, we're all dead. The next section after this module is what we refer to as fiscal policy. The federal government, El Presidente, the executive branch, and then Congress, the House and the Senate, when they take actions to restore full employment domestic output, to adjust the economy in an effort to get back to our long-run macroeconomic equilibrium when we have demand pull inflation or we have a recessionary gap, right? We'll talk about the very tricky situation of cost-push inflation. But in this section, we're going to talk about this idea of flexible wages and prices, automatic adjustments. So we're going to go back to our handy-dandy aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, and we're going to talk about how unemployment will revert back to its NRU after a shock, after a supply shock or demand shock. Then we'll talk about the long-run aggregate supply curve and how that will change the ultimate level of output and employment. And then we'll talk about how a shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve is used to demonstrate economic growth. So again, real quick, we know that supply shocks and demand shocks move the economy away from our long-run equilibrium. In the next modules, 3.8, 3.9, we'll talk about government actions, government's attempts to restore the economy. But this module, we're going to talk about that self-righting mechanism that classical theorists advocate as the way for the economy to heal itself when we're out of whack. Macroeconomic equilibrium is not at our long-run equilibrium. Some folks like to get away, take a holiday from the neighborhood. Hop a flight to Miami Beach or to Hollywood. I'm taking a Greyhound down that Hudson River line, 'cause I'm in a New York state of mind. All right, little Billy Joel for you there. The economy can be in one of two states. One of two states with respect to short-run and long-run aggregate supply curves, right? So we can have this collision, this collision, where the curves in which aggregate output and potential output coincide. So we have output Y at the intersection of both the short-run aggregate supply curve or the long-run aggregate supply curve. Or we can have this sort of mismatch where we have equilibrium on the short-run aggregate supply curve, but not the long-run aggregate supply curve. The purpose of this analysis is to demonstrate shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve in response to changes in nominal wages. And we have this misalignment of the short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve. Evaluate the economy at A1. What's the level of real GDP output at A1? Notice that Y1, the level of real GDP, is greater than the economy's potential level of GDP at YP. Right? The long-run aggregate supply curve always demonstrates the nation's potential level of output. Think operating on the production possibilities curve. Think full employment. Right? So if the economy is operating at Y1, a level of real GDP beyond the economy's potential GDP, how's that going to affect the labor market? Well, definitely no cyclical unemployment, and the actual unemployment rate is going to be below the natural rate of unemployment. So the unemployment rate is going to be in the 3s. A low level of unemployment, what's that going to do to nominal wages? Well, jobs are abundant, but workers are scarce. Jobs are abundant, workers are scarce. That's going to drive up nominal wages, In response to the increase in nominal wages, there will be a leftward shift of the aggregate short-run aggregate supply curve. Continuing with our analysis of shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve, evaluate this macroeconomic situation. At A1, we have P1 aggregate price level, and then we evaluate Y1 level of real GDP, Y1 level of output. In this scenario, actual GDP, Y1, is below potential GDP. Remember, long-run aggregate supply curve always demonstrates the economy's potential level of output at full employment. So now we are not at full employment. We have a level of real GDP or real output that's lower than potential. Well, that's recessionary, right? If we're not producing as much real output as we could, what's going to be the result? Right? A low level of output means higher unemployment, so cyclical unemployment. The actual unemployment rate is above our 4% NRU, natural rate of unemployment. So let's think about this and its effect on wages. Here we have a situation where workers are abundant. There's lots of citizens who would love to go get a job. Unfortunately, jobs are scarce, right? Because workers are abundant and jobs are scarce, this is going to push down nominal wages, right? The decrease in nominal wages over time, that will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right, an increase in short-run aggregate supply. Time to revisit inflationary gap and recessionary gap introduced in 3.5 and talk about the idea of long-run self-adjustment in response to recessionary or inflationary gap. All right, here's the situation. What should we do? Yeah, we should do nothing, right? This is long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. All right, we have our short-run aggregate supply curve as our AS1, our aggregate demand curve, equilibrium E1, and it coincides, it collides with long-run aggregate supply. Everything's perfect in the economy, right? Full potential economic output. But we just talked about the idea of how is the economy in the long run going to respond to the shocks. So let's first talk about a negative demand shock. All right, so before I tell you what's going to happen, think in your head. All right, what's going to affect demand? What's going to affect demand? Consumer spending, investment spending. Right, so a decrease in consumer confidence, right? A crash in the stock markets, investment spending. Businesses don't feel so good about the profit horizon moving forward. They cut back on capital investment, causes a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. All right, so we were at E1 with P1, Y1, full employment domestic outputs. But then what happens? Right? Now we've had a reduced aggregate price level and reduced output. Remember, decrease in aggregate demand, price level and output move in the same direction as aggregate demand. That is to say, Y GDP declines from Y1 to Y2, and downward pressure on aggregate price level. At E2, we have price level of P2. So we've now introduced a negative demand shock into the economy, causing a recession. What happens during a recession? We know what happens during a recession. Unemployment up. So we have cyclical unemployment. The unemployment rate is well above our NRU. We say got 8% unemployment, right? So this recessionary gap between Y1 and Y2, right? There's a recessionary gap. The economy is now achieving economic output at Y2. The difference between Y2 and Y1 is our recessionary gap. Right, this is something you should already be able to identify. Now, what about the long run? Now, how long is the long run? All right, we can't put a definitive time on this, but given enough time, now we're going to talk about that automatic adjustment we just discussed in the previous section, right? Eventually, we have this idea of, all right, look, at E2, think about unemployment, think about jobs, think about wages. So we have job scarcity, and we have lots of citizens who would like to work. So we have abundant amount of workers, and we have a scarcity of jobs. What's that going to do? That's going to push down nominal wages, right? And we're going to have this self-righting mechanism of an increase in the short-run aggregate supply because of the downward pressure on nominal wages. Right? Businesses can now hire workers at lower wages. Right? What is the long-run adjustment that the economy makes? Eventually, we move back to potential GDP at Y1. Right? And at Y1, what's happened? Right? Aggregate output is back at potential level, and we have a lower price level than we did in the initial scenario. So after the shock at E3, right, we had our initial decrease in aggregate demand. We had our long-run response of a rightward shift of the aggregate supply curve in response to that lower nominal wages. At our new equilibrium E3, output is restored to full potential GDP at a new price level of P3. Time to evaluate another scenario. We always start off with the perfect picture of the economy. Think the U.S. economy in late 2006, early 2007, before the Great Recession. Think about the U.S. economy in 2018, 2019, before the pandemic. Full employment, domestic output, firing on all cylinders. Everything was good. Right, we have GDP growing about 2.5%, unemployment about 4%, and we have a price level about 2%. Right? Actual GDP aligns with potential GDP. Everything's happy-go-lucky. Now, in this situation, we're not going to be evaluating a negative demand shock. We're going to talk about a positive demand shock. Right? So think demand pull inflation. What has happened? We have a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. That's going to ruin our nice E1 equilibrium. Right? So when aggregate demand shifts to the right, when we were at potential GDP, what's the impact on price level and output? So aggregate price level increases from P1 to P2. Inflationary pressures. And output increases from Y1 to Y2. That arrow is actually moving in the wrong direction there, boys. It should be pointing the other way from Y1 towards Y2. So the rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, right? What effect does it have? Well, first, output increases from Y1 to Y2, driving up price level from P1 to P2, inflationary pressures. If you think about, okay, what's going on in the labor market at Y2? Well, at Y1 was full employment, the natural rate of unemployment, 4% unemployment. At Y2, we definitely have a decrease in the unemployment rate in the short run, right? Decrease in the unemployment rate in the short run. So think about labor market, think about demand supply, think about, okay, there's lots and lots of people working, right? That's putting upward pressure on prices, right? Because we have this strong economy, right? Jobs are plentiful, right? But labor is scarce. This creates what we call an inflationary gap, right? The difference between Y1 and Y2, the difference between actual GDP at Y2 versus potential GDP at Y1, we have this inflationary gap caused by the rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. All right, that's the situation right now. But eventually, in the long run, what happens with this self-righting mechanism, this self-adjustment? Well, we know that if jobs are plentiful and labor is scarce, that's going to push up nominal wages from P2 to P3. All right, that's going to push up nominal wages from P2 to P3. And that will cause, because wage prices increasing will weigh on short-run aggregate supply, that will, in the long run, cause aggregate supply to decrease from SRAS1 to SRAS2. So what has happened? Right? This moves the economy back from Y2 back towards Y1, our initial level of potential GDP. So we have closed the inflationary gap and we're back at potential GDP. So after the initial shock of an increase in aggregate demand causing demand pull inflation, right, we end up ultimately at E3, where output is back where it was when we started, potential GDP, and a new price level of P3. All right, time to revisit our favorite economic tool, the production possibilities model. So let's look right first. B, production possibility. Original production possibility curve, PPC. All right, it's got that concavity. Remember the law of increasing opportunity cost because we got capital goods on the vertical, consumer goods on the horizontal. The best we could ever produce for now is along the original PPC, given our fixed resources and our fixed technology. So scarce land, capital, and labor, fixed productivity and technology. But then what happens? All of a sudden we have an increase in the quantity or quality of resources or an improvement in technology. So we have a better educated workforce, we have more efficient capital, right? We have more productive land, or we inject some productivity increase in the economy based on technological advancements. That shifts the production possibility frontier, the curve from the original to the new production possibility frontier. Well, that increase in the quantity or quality of resources or improvement in technology, remember technology drives 67% or 2/3 of economic growth, that's going to shift the long run aggregate supply curve from its existing vertical position at LARS to LARS1, right? Now that's great for us. That's awesome that over time, what's happened? We had a rightward shift of the long run aggregate supply curve. Well, that increase is our entire potential level of outputs. Right? Not only does it increase our entire potential level of real GDP, it means that there's going to be an increase in the number of jobs made available in the economy. Now, productivity increases or advances in technology that allows us to generate more output per unit of input is also non-inflationary economic growth for the economy. Right? Now this last panel says, oh, it shows economic growth as we move from our original PPC to our new, right? That's exactly what happens. So rightward shift in the production possibilities curve causes a rightward shift in the long run aggregate supply curve, more potential output, more jobs in the economy. And if it's driven by efficiency of productivity, that's extremely beneficial for the economy because we can grow in a non-inflationary manner. All right, time for you to demonstrate your understanding of this section of macroeconomic learning. Another FRQ for you to work on. All right, what does this one say? All right, draw a correctly labeled ADAS graph, aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, showing an economy in long run equilibrium. All right, if you can't do that, just quit, please. All right, you all got to be able to do that like the back of your hands. All right, this is easy peasy lemon squeezy. So I'm not kidding. You should draw this in your notebook or on maybe you can do it on your phone on some drawing tool. Get used to doing this because then it's in your brain. It's etched in your brain, right? So draw the aggregate demand curve, aggregate supply curve in the long run equilibrium. Then label correctly price level and aggregate output as P1, Y1, right? So they're going to give you credit for just drawing the graph correctly, drawing the long run equilibrium graph, right? Remember, label your axes. Now, here's what gets a little more challenging. Assume the economy experiences a negative demand shock. Now, on the AP exam, instead of them just giving you that, assume the economy experiences a negative demand shock, they might say, assume that consumer confidence or consumer expectations falls and or investment spending falls in response to businesses believing there's less profit potential in the near future, right? But they're telling you here what's going to happen. They say, assume the economy experiences a negative demand shock. So show the effect of the demand shock on the graph, right? Label the new price level and real GDP PL2, Y2, right? Now this is the part where you really have to pay attention and say, okay, initial equilibrium is PL1, Y1. Now they want you to show, okay, what happens initially when there is a negative demand shock, right? What happens when there's a negative demand shock? Label that PL2, Y2. Now, we've been talking about the self-correcting mechanism of the capitalist system. So assume there's no government action. How will the negative demand shock affect nominal wages? What will happen to nominal wages? All right, and then explain, why that will happen. Part C, show the effect of the change in nominal wages from Part B on the graph. So you've already drawn a change in aggregate demand. Now think, okay, in response to the change in nominal wages, there's going to be some change in short-run aggregate supply. Indicate the new long-run equilibrium price and real GDP on your graph as PL3 and Y3. Right? So take your time, hit pause here, get to work on this, and let's see how we did. All right, let's see how we did. The question is repeated up here on the right, and all parts of the graph are available on the left. So how did you attack this question? All right, the first parts are stuff that you got to get right, because there's no way you're going to be able to answer the difficult pieces of the puzzle if you can't get the obvious, right? So the first piece of the puzzle, you draw your downward sloping AD1 and your upward sloping SRAS1, and you put a point where they come together, label that E1, and then you draw your long run aggregate supply curve vertically through there, right? And make certain, please, that you've labeled your axes correctly, right? So you got on the vertical axis aggregate price level, on the horizontal real GDP, right? So you've already set it up. Now you're like, okay, that's where we are. That's the starting scenario. Then the question asks you to graph what happens from E1 when there is a what? A negative demand shock, right? So we're at E1. You've already correctly labeled and drawn your three curves and your axes respectively. And now what happens? All right, now we have a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So our negative demand shock shifts aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. We have a new equilibrium at E2. And it asks you what's going on right at E2. So you correctly label P2 and Y2 respectively on the vertical axis and horizontal axis to make certain that you now have identified what's going on with price level and GDP, real output, at E2. Then you have to say that this negative demand shock, right, causes nominal prices to fall. It wouldn't hurt to say that this is a recessionary gap. So the difference between Y2 and Y1, right now the economy is in a recessionary gap. During a recession, unemployment rises well above the natural rate of unemployment. And because there's a high level of unemployment, right, jobs are scarce, citizens who are willing and able to work are plentiful, that drives down nominal wages, right, because it asks you to say what happened to nominal wages, right? Now, in response to the drop in nominal wages, now we have in the long run, and you should actually say that, in the long run response is that because nominal wages have fallen, the short run aggregate supply curve will shift from SRAS1 to SRAS2, and now we have a new equilibrium, right? We're back at our original level of output. We call this, now notice they squeeze it in there, Y3 level of output, where SRAS2 intersects with AD2 and Y1, right? Our long run aggregate supply curve. And you must finally say that at E3, at our new equilibrium, right, output is back at potential and the price level is lower than the original. And then you have completed the question correctly. All right, excellent work.